Hello folks, welcome to my YouTube channel, Watercolor Impressions. Today we're going to paint a swan. I'm going to provide the reference and drawing template so you guys can follow this tutorial with me. As you can see in the reference, there's a lot of difficulties and obstacles in the reflections as well as the reflection of the swan. So the key thing here is to simplify our scene, and we have to make sure the reflections are easy to read. I'm also going to give a drawing template so you guys can draw from it or trace from it. But I highly recommend drawing from it because it trains your eye in other parts of your work as well. So let's get started. In any watercolors, the light wash is the first wash. So I'm going to do the Cerulean Blue wash at the top, but I'm making sure it's really weak because I'm using less pigment and more water at the top. And I also want to collect the bead. So I'm just throwing a little bit of greens from my leftover palette. So I'm throwing colors wherever I can see it. And I'm also making sure that I'm not going over my swan because that's create a good silhouette, and we are using white paper as our paint. So it saves a lot of time for us. It's the same thing. I'm taking down the wash with the Cerulean Blue and a little bit of cat yellow in it. So you can see there's a little bit of tinge of green in it. So it's a little bit warmer. But as it comes to the mid-ground, I'm going to increase my pigment consistency. So I'm using Cobalt Turquoise, and I'm also making sure that it's not going over my swan as well. So I'm also taking the wash all the way down, and I think I'm going to do this mid-ground till his tail. And after that, I'm going to make my consistency darker. And I also spray some waters here and there because it helps watercolors to mix and blend properly by itself. So that's a beautiful thing about watercolors. So you can see I'm just being careful. I studied my hand and I'm just making sure I'm going over it. So you can see it's already coming along the silhouette. And as you can see in the reference, is one part of his leg is on the water, so I'm keeping that in mind, but I will do it at the end. But I will just have a cube, but that I will paint over it so we can know it. As comes to the foreground, I'm gonna increase my pigment consistency. What I mean by that is more pigment. The reason being the foreground being dominant is bringing your focal point in the painting. I flipped the canvas here because there was a sudden transitioning happening near the neck of his swan. So I want to make sure that there is not any sudden transition because it will break our viewer's eye from the focal point. So I'm making sure that I want to there is not any sudden transitions in my water, especially near his neck. But if you go over the swan, so be it, and you can use white paint to bring it back. So don't fuss about it. So I'm spraying some water, and I also see in the foreground it's not that darker. It's not leading in. So what I'm going to do, I'm taking Ultramarine Blue, French Ultramarine Blue. So I'm increasing the pigment consistency here. As you can see, it gets darker. So I'm kind of making sure it blends properly. So I'm also making sure, seeing at my reference, I'm also putting impression of waves there. So the point of this painting is the swan, not the water. So I'm not worried about water that much. I want to make sure it is really weak. So you can see wherever I see the sudden transitions, I'm making sure that I'm getting rid of it. And making sure I steady my hand and not going over the swan. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do impression of waves so that here my consistency is really thick. So less water, more pigment in my brush. I'm just doing impression of waves, bigger at the bottom and smaller at the top. So it kind of creates a perspective in our waters. So when it dries, it becomes impression of waves. And it also creates a really good foreground and sense of depth in our water. So that's a point of doing that. So the next step here is to jump onto the... I did let the painting dry for a bit. Now I'm focusing on the mid-tones. So at the top, I'm using raw amber and a little bit of burnt amber in it. So I can get that warmish, brownish color in his neck. As you can see, I'm going a little darker where the base is, and I'm using clean water to rub it off as it goes down. So you can see it creates a beautiful gradient, and it also creates a form for our swan neck. So I'm just increasing the pigment consistency. That means more pigment, less water wherever his neck starts, and I'm all the way, bring that down, based on the reference. So now I'm jumping onto the wings. I'm using Cerulean Blue and a little bit of Cobalt Blue in it, and it also really weak in my reference, so I'm making sure to put that. And sometimes I do that intentionally because I don't have to be super accurate to the reference, because as artists we are sending a visual language to the viewer, so it's an expression, so you don't have to be 100% accurate to your reference. So be creative and do whatever feels right to you. And I'm adding the darker tone because that separates his neck from his body, so I want to make sure that I add that. And there's also a partial shadow under his wing, and which connects the tail. You can see I'm going a little bit weak on it because that's how in the reference as well, and I'm going a little bit warmer. So I'm using yellow ochre and a little bit of green left over from my palette. So now I'm going to be focusing on the back of the tail. So I'm using clean water to rub it off at the tail because I want to create a gradient and a transitioning happening at the tail. So as I put a darker value, I'm using Cerulean Blue and a little bit of Cobalt tinge in it. So you can see I'm also going a little bit darker at the bottom. I'm also going to add French Ultramarine Blue at the top. So it creates a gradient from top to bottom and it runs through. So now we will be jumping on to the legs, and leg is a little bit of I have a little bit of difficulty. I had a little bit of difficulty doing it because one part is on the water, and so other parts are showing up in the reference. So I'm using Alizarin Crimson, and this is our first wash, so I'm making it really weak. I didn't have any other pigment added, so I'm using clean water at the bottom to create a form that, so his belly kind of have a gradient from bottom to the top. So I want to create the gradient to create that form. As you can see, as soon as I put the gradient, our swan getting a little bit of a 3D form in it. So that's really important when you paint, because I've seen a lot of watercolor paintings which looks really flat, and sometimes if I see in my work. Let's jump on to the beak now. So the beak has two parts, this orange part and the black part. For the black part I'm not worried about it because it's just going to be pure black. So I'm using cat orange, and you can use any colors you want, but in the reference it's kind of a little bit of orange and red combined. And when it comes to his head, the black part, I'm using just thick neutral tint because it's really dark in the painting. That's a really darkest value in our painting, so I make sure that I put the darker value there to create the gradient. And you can see three-dimensional forms already in his head, so it creates the illusion of forms there. So now we are jumping on to the leg. So now I'm adding the darker value of the leg now. So you can see in the reference it's kind of wrapped around. One part of his leg is going underneath the water and the other part is showing above the water. So now I want to anchor my swan, which anchors him in the water. So as you can see, I'm using Ultramarine Blue, and I'm going with thick pigment with less of water. It's almost a thick pigment there. So as soon as I add the darker pigment, you can see the swan sits on the water. So that's really important, and I've seen a lot of work which an object doesn't anchors on the ground. So that's really important to add the detail whenever you do a painting. And I also saw the tail shadow is really weak, and it also looks warmer in the reference, but I add a little bit of green tinge in it to make it have a little bit of color variations in my. I also noticed that the tail also looked weak, so I'm going to increase the pigment consistency there. These are the things you have to take care in your painting. Whenever things look weak, you go and add darker value there, but it's based on your reference. You don't add darker values if it's not in your reference, because that creates a shadow forms and three-dimensional forms to our painting. So now I'm going on to the beak, and the beak has two shapes to it, two tones to it. The top part of the beak is lighter, and the bottom part is darker. So I want to make sure that I add the darker tone there so that it creates two parts. There is the top part and the bottom part. Now we are jumping onto the reflection, and I'm using Cobalt Turquoise and a little bit of French Ultramarine Blue. And as you can see in the reference, our reflection is super complex. So the key here is to simplify, simplify, simplify. And I also know how reflection works on water. So I know the fundamentals of it. If you want to know the fundamentals of reflection, I made a tutorial, fundamentals of reflection, in my YouTube channel. You guys can go and watch it. And I also have it in my description, so you guys can go and check it out. So as soon as I did the reflection of the swan, you can see the swan literally anchors on the water itself. So even reflection has a lot of values. There is 3 values there, darker value, mid-tone and highlights, but I'm going to go with the mid-tone and a darker value. So the darker way are usually wherever it anchors, wherever it sits on the surface. So you can see I'm using NeutralTint, and I'm just adding wherever I see darker value. And make sure this is how you finish your painting, by adding darker values in your painting. But make sure that you squint your eyes to look at your reference, or look at something when you're painting outside. Squint your eyes, so it will give a reference point where you can add the darker values there. You can see as soon as I add the darker values, the painting took place already. And I also squint my eyes and I saw the reference again to see any darker values, and I can see it on the legs, so I'm kind of adding it. Even on the legs I see a mid value, so I'm adding that mid value on his leg. As I said in the beginning of this tutorial, one part of his leg is on the water, so I want to make sure that that part is in the water as well too. And we're almost at the end of our painting journey. So I'm using clean water underneath his head, and I'm using Ultramarine Blue, a little bit of NeutralTint to create the gradient, so it creates forms for his head. So as soon as we add the detail, you can see his head came into shape. So keep on adding the darker values based on my reference. I make sure I match the darker value there too. That's it. We're at the end of our painting journey. If you enjoyed this tutorial, let me know what you learned from this video. What's your favorite color in this painting? And what techniques you learned from today, and how are you going to use it in your part of your work? Let me know in the comments. If you follow this tutorial and did a painting of this one, share it with me. I'd love to check your paintings too. Thanks again for watching this video. Please like, subscribe and comment below. And good luck with your painting, folks.